Welcome back to the Public Service Commission. We are continuing with docket number 2022-89-G, the rate case involving Piedmont Natural Gas. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. We have with us virtually Commissioner Irvin. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Jay Williams, Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carol Lee Williams, and Commissioner Caston and Chair Belser. Before we begin, we're still on Mr. Coyne, but before we begin, I want to clarify something that Mr. Huber asked this morning with regard to witnesses that are being stipulated in. If y'all will provide verification for all stipulated witnesses so that we'll have that in the record. If there are questions from commissioners that cannot be answered by any of the witnesses who are appearing as ROE witnesses or settlement witnesses, then we will notify you then that we would need, or try to notify you in the morning if possible, if there are any additional questions for witnesses not already that we plan to take live. Does that help you, Mr. Huber and everybody else?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I apologize for misapprehending the question this morning.
Thank you for clarifying, Madam Chair. Thank you.
But we do need verification sheets from everybody, and if there are any corrections, please let us know about that as well. So we are on commissioner questions still for Mr. Coyne. Mr. Coyne, you are still under oath, sir. Vice Chair Powers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Coyne, thank you. As other commissioners have stated, we appreciate your patience with us because a lot of this is a learning process. And you mentioned sometime early on that you like history, that history is a subject, and I'm a history buff and enjoy it myself. But it seems to me that a lot of this is just, as you said, with the change in the economy the last 3 years, nobody could have projected that it's all kind of a moving target. Is that a fair statement?
It is. Capital markets have been in a state of great flux and volatility.
Okay. And I know that you seem to indicate that makes things a lot more risky. And looking at some of the rebuttal stuff, some of the criticism, I think, was that your analysis is more historical than it is as far as recent by one of the people. And my question is this, and it may just be totally rhetorical. You did your update in June, which affected your numbers. And I looked at the newspaper today. Stock market's gone up 4 weeks in a row. Recent legislation, which I really don't know much about, that has passed, is supposed to have such a big impact. Does anything, we're in August, is there anything that has happened that would change your determinations that you reached in June?
Well, even with all the change we've seen over the last 3 months, which has been the evolution of the war in Ukraine and these incredibly high inflation numbers, my numbers didn't change materially, and the recommended or the central tendency of all four models still hangs in around the same number it did back in February. So I'm encouraged by that. I wouldn't say that there is nothing that would happen that wouldn't change my analysis or recommendation, because it certainly could. But one of the reasons why I like the four model approach is it provides you with more stability than it does if you're looking at just the CAPM model or just the DCF model that are so heavily reliant on current and recent market data that they can be unreliable in these periods of time when markets are as volatile as they are. The expected earnings model and the risk premium model provide stability to those results, and they did not change that much period to period. So I would say that for what we can see around capital market conditions, I feel reasonably confident that if I were to sit in front of you 3 months from now, that these numbers would probably be in an equivalent range. Beyond that, the capital market conditions we'll face next year and the year beyond that could certainly change.
So you feel using the historical data is more accurate and less fluctuating than market data, which I think was the approach Mr. Rothschild had, just putting it simply.
Well, not entirely, because I've relied on a mixture of historic market data and forecasts. But what I haven't done, and that's where I have used historic data, for example, on stock prices. I go back over 30 days and up as far as 6 months in terms of looking at utility stock prices to form the DCF model. And that's a pretty much standard practice, because if you go back over 6 months, you have a sense of where that company is trading. But the projection for earnings growth in the DCF model is coming from a 5-year forecast. So I have 6 months of history, but I also have a 5-year forecast of earnings. So it's grounded in recent history, but it's based on a projection. In the case of the CAPM model, for example, that is based on, I based it on my recommendation on current 30-day average interest rates as as the basis for my recommendation. Although I did consider a 5-year forecast, that didn't form the basis of my recommendation. I did look at a forecast of the market equity return for the total return that's based on 5-year analyst forecasts. But I also looked at history going back to 1926, and I averaged them. So I took history and forecast. So I like to think that there's balance in that approach, using history where I think it's reliable, and forecast where it's practical and necessary and can still give you reliable results. Where I differ with Mr. Rothschild, as he has taken a very thin market, and that is the options trading market for utilities, and looked at how those options are trading over the next 3 months as a basis for forming the engine of his capital asset pricing model, beta, and came up with a determination that looks very different from any that I would use or any other analyst would typically use. His beta using his method averages 0.64 to 0.59, whereas that estimated by Mr. Baudino and myself is both 0.83, because we're taking it from Value Line, and every investor has access to Value Line, and that's based on 5 years of history around how those stocks have traded vis-a-vis the broader market. I'm not opposed to looking at alternative ways of looking at the future, but it needs to be done reliably and not based on an academic journal article and thinly traded option data that just don't provide you with a reliable method. And I think that's indicated in the results that are produced by those methods that show you that more work needs to be done. You can't consider a model that would produce negative numbers as a rate of return, and assuming without recognizing that I think that there are some issues associated with that.
Okay. Thank you, sir. That's all I have.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Caston?
Sorry, Mr. Corn, me again. I had time to think. I'm sorry. But thank you for your patience. I really appreciate it. Commissioner Thomas may have asked this to some degree, but I want to make sure I understand. Like in your proxy group, in the proxy group you have listed, do you know how many in your proxy group are allowed purchase gas adjustments or rate stabilization adjustments, weather normalization adjustments?
Yes.
How many?
Well, you asked 3 different questions, so.
Okay.
Purchase gas adjustment clauses, all of them do.
Okay.
Yeah. Rate stabilization is unique to South Carolina. That's your specific piece of legislation. So no one company has the exact same clause as South Carolina has, but others have capital cost trackers and other mechanisms that produce similar results for them. They're not constructed exactly the same. And I'm sorry, the third piece you asked about was weather
normalization adjustment.
Yes, I believe that. Well, I have it in my rebuttal testimony. My recollection is that every one of these companies has weather normalization. It's a very standard feature for a gas utility because it's in the best interest of both companies and the customer. But I'll check that table I think I put together on that very issue. I'm not putting my hands on it right away, but I feel reasonably certain that every one of these companies has a weather normalization clause. So I think that's my recollection.
Okay. And why do you think these commissions have included such as those?
I believe the found them to be in the best interest of both companies and customers. With a natural gas utility, circumstances can change month to month, quarter to quarter. Particularly, purchased natural gas prices are highly volatile, and we've seen situations prior to the introduction of purchased gas adjustment clauses for gas utilities or equivalent for electric utilities, where if it's deemed that those costs are ultimately recovered from customers, and if the company has to accumulate those charges over some period of time, if it were to come in after 2 or 3 years with an accumulated deficit and cost recovery, then that could lead to rate shock for customers. And so they'll have a sudden increase in rates that's generally not seen to be in the best interest of customers. And the opposite is also true. If the company has overestimated the cost of gas or purchase power, then it could be over collecting revenues at a time when a consumer could be paying a lower rate. So generally it's deemed to be in the best interest of both the company and customers to have these types of costs track closely with the actual, so you don't have this buildup in arrears that would adversely affect rates in an unnecessary way. And it's also generally understood that the weather is outside of utilities' control, and the commodity costs of gas, for example, are outside of a company's direct control.
When do these type programs increase the utilities' risk or decrease it, or does it have no effect one way or the other?
Generally speaking, they improve the quality of cash flow for the company because to the extent that it's incurring these costs and it's able to true them up in a short period of time, it reduces the volatility and uncertainty of its cash flows, and therefore it reduces the company's risk versus a company that doesn't have those provisions.
Would that be the same case with the rate stabilization, RSA?
Well, again, it depends upon the features of the RSA versus the comparable companies. And as you recall, I indicated earlier that the other companies have equivalent decoupling mechanisms and rate riders for the recovery of capital costs, as well as decoupling mechanisms that made them equivalent from a risk perspective. So the RSA provisions makes Piedmont look more like its competitors and its comparable companies in terms of those provisions.
So programs such as these, including the statute or the Rate Stabilization Act, can help customers by not having huge price spikes all at one time. They're still going to get it. It's just going to be a gradual pain rather than just an immediate punch in the face. and I don't, that's bad terminology. I'm saying it's going to be what it's going to be, but this allows it to, I guess, be eased over shorter periods of time.
And I assume that's what's behind the name of the statute and why it's called the Rate Stabilization Act, because it does serve that purpose.
And it, relative to the utility, it's also has benefits for the utility too. I mean,
Yes, it does.
and some of that would be if they're going to recover that later, at least from a cash flow point of view. Is that what you were saying? They are able to receive, I guess, cash sooner rather than later, and use that cash sooner than later. Is that?
Yes. That's a fair characterization.
And on page 40 of your direct testimony, it's at the bottom of page 40. It's probably .42 of 106 on the side. You reference Exhibit JMC 7, and I think you state you list on page 40 of your direct testimony, toward the bottom there, lines 18 through 23. You mentioned the mean and median for the expected earnings, but basically, looking at JMC 7, that is value line, well, that's all I saw on there. Value line 2024 through 2026 expected earnings for your proxy group. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And in that first column, in alphabetical order, the value line ROE, in other words, the expected earnings, is 9%, 12%, 12%, 8%, 7.5%, 8%. I mean, that's what the projection is,
Yes,
the
it is.
expected. So, and I read what you said. You looked at, some different things relative to that. But if that is what the expected earning is, why is DCA's earnings so out of kilter relative to those?
Why? Could you restate the question? Why is
If-
who's ROE out of kilter? That's the part I didn't hear, Commissioner.
I'm sorry. If these expected earnings, these ROEs value line from 2024, 2026, in that first column, range from there are 2 12s, 1 9, 2 8s, and a 7.5. And I think the DCAs were, I don't remember off the top of my head, but kind of somewhere in that range, I think. What am I missing? Help me understand why what numbers they show. You didn't say crazy, but way out of kilter.
Mm-hmm.
But these expected earnings are listed as that.
All right. Let me see if I can help.
Yes.
There are a couple of pieces to that. One is the DCA's witness has recommended a 7.86% ROE in a range from 6.98 to 8.74. Right. So the I'll describe in a moment why these numbers are different than those, but that we're in both cases, we're talking about ROE. So I'll try to draw that comparison. So if these projected ROEs are at the holding company level for each of the companies in the proxy group. So it's not an attempt to determine the allowed return or the appropriate return for the investor, but it's what Value Line is expecting that holding company to earn as a return over this period of time. And you can see that range even for these projected earned returns is what they are, range from 7.5 to 12 on the high side. I haven't taken the average of those, but I'm sure it wouldn't look like 7.86. That's one ingredient into, in this case, the expected earnings model. And the results of the expected earnings model produces an estimate of using those as a direct input, which is not an appropriate question to ask. They result in a 9.94% ROE expectation across that proxy group using the most current report. So using that very data would produce a result of 9.94%, not 7.86% as recommended by Mr. Rothschild. They cover a range, and if you take that range and put it into an expected earnings framework, that expectation is 9.94%.
And that's where you got I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, and you can even see that this was, in my direct testimony, it was 9.77, and you can see that is the number, the mean, over to the right-hand side in column 10.
Correct. And
those numbers range from a low of 788 to a high of 1241.
You have a mean of 9.77 and median of 8.89% in that last column.
That's right.
And I studied this. This isn't my strength, so I'm not going to act like it is. But I did try to understand it. I tried to understand what you wrote, and I tried to look at the columns, and you got value line common equity ratio 2024, 2026. So I'm assuming that's an estimated or projected common equity ratio, correct? I mean, is that?
That's precisely what it is, yes. On a going forward basis, yes. For the holding company.
But again, it's still projected. It's not 2 + 2 = 4 every time, right?
No, it is projected.
Okay.
Yes, you're correct.
So all these things are still based on projections or guesstimates based on something.
Yes, in the case of Value Line, it's based on their analyst projections of how much capital the company will invest over that period of time. And it's also based on their projection of how the holding company will finance those capital investments and therefore the resulting equity ratio based on how they believe the company will actually finance these investments.
Understand. And finally, I just kind of want to make sure, and I'm probably taking liberties with this assessment, but prior to us breaking for lunch, I think in questioning to Commissioner Justin Williams and Commissioner Irvin, in essence, it kind of sounded like, and this is not clearly verbatim, but it kind of sounded like if the commission kind of didn't go along with what Piedmont's recommendation was, or worst case, the stipulation, then the rating could go to heck in a handbasket. Maybe everyone's in South Carolina could. Would be violating the Supreme Court order or ruling. And you didn't say the sky would fall, but I kind of couldn't help but feel that was generally your opinion if we did not adopt 9.49 or above. Is that a fair assessment?
Not quite, Commissioner. I was drawing a parallel between the recommendation and national averages that form a reasonable basis for thinking about what an allowed return for gas utility should be, and contrasting those with a recommendation such as Mr. Rothschild's, which would be so out of bounds. And as a result of that, the implications that I was drawing would be around the company's credit rating and implications for how the investment community would view South Carolina regulatory environment. And so I'm drawing a distinction between an extreme, such as that recommended by Mr. Rothschild, and those central tendencies around the model results that I've shared with you, as well as the national averages that I think form a reasonable framework for thinking about an allowed ROE.
Okay, and I guess in the questioning of other witnesses, it might help clear up some of this, but because what I'm trying to understand as a commissioner, and perhaps others are, is, in my previous life, pi r squared, pi d squared over 4, it works every time. If you want to know the area of a circle, use this equation. It's repeatable, works every time. And then if you want to design a beam, you use this empirical data. It's going to be that way. That's 60 KSI steel. It's going to work. In this, it's everybody's got an opinion. And it's about this projection or this projection. And the only projection I really count on is what God says happened at the end. Other than that, when I look back at history on the projections, it seems like most people are wrong most of the time. And I'm not saying you are, but who knows? In any event, you've been very gracious and you've been very kind, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
I appreciate your comments, Commissioner.
Commissioners, any further questions? Any redirect?
No redirect, Chair Belzer.
Thank you. Mr. Coyne, thank you for your testimony today. You may stand down.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Elliott, is your witness next? Yes, ma'am. Mr. Jeffries?
Yes, I'm not sure I've mastered this microphone yet. I just wanted to make sure on the record that Mr. Coyne is dismissed and he can assume his travels, his family travels.
I always tell the parties that's at your peril. But if you ask that he be dismissed, he may be.
I am, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, this is Chris Schubert, the ORS. Can I raise one brief housekeeping matter? Mr. Baldino has a conflict starting at 11. The commission wanted him to testify next ahead of Mr. Rothschild, or you wanted to keep the current order, which would be Rothschild and then Baldino.
If the parties have worked that out, I think we're fine with that.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Call Kevin O'Donnell to the stand.
Mr. O'Donnell, if you would raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you.
Mr. O'Donnell, would you state and spell your last name for the record?
It is Kevin O'Donnell, capital O apostrophe capital D-O-N-E-L-L.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. O'Donnell, by whom are you employed?
Nova Energy Consultants,
And in what capacity?
President.
And what are your duties and responsibilities at Nova?
Basically, we're a utility rate consulting firm, so we do all types of financial analyses for municipal utilities, university utilities, and consumer groups in these rate cases.
Thank you, sir. Now, Mr. O'Donnell, did you cause to be prepared and pre-filed with this commission 16 pages of corrected direct testimony?
Yes, I did.
Have you had a chance to review your corrected direct testimony prior to your appearance here this afternoon?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any corrections, revisions, or additions to your corrected direct testimony?
No, I do not.
If I asked you those same questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Madam Chair, I would move the corrected direct testimony of Kevin W. O'Donnell, CFA, into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. O'Donnell's corrected direct testimony will be admitted into the record as if given orally.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. O'Donnell, did you prepare 2 exhibits and 1 appendix as a part of your direct testimony?
Yes, I did.
Have you had a chance to review your exhibits and appendix?
Yes.
Do you have any revisions, corrections, or additions to those documents?
No, I do not.
Madam Chair, would move Mr. O'Donnell's exhibits and appendix, if I may, as a composite hearing exhibit.
Mr. O'Donnell's Appendix A and Exhibits KW0 or KWO 1 and 2 will be marked as a composite exhibit as hearing exhibit 5 and entered into the record of the case.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, Mr. O'Donnell, did you cause to be prepared and pre-filed with this commission 9 pages of surrebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Have you had a chance to review your surrebuttal testimony prior to your appearance here this afternoon?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections, revisions, or additions to your surrebuttal testimony?
No.
If I asked you those same questions this afternoon, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Madam Chair, I would move the surrebuttal testimony of Kevin W. O'Donnell, CFA, into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. O'Donnell's surrebuttal testimony will be admitted into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, ma'am. And pursuant to a stipulation among all the parties, we are tendering Mr. O'Donnell as an expert in the capital structure, cost of capital, financial analyses of regulated utilities, and their rate design.
Mr. O'Donnell is accepted as an expert in the areas you've identified.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, Mr. O'Donnell, have you prepared a summary of your direct and surrebuttal testimonies?
Yes, I did.
Would you please present it to the commission at this time?
In my pre-filed testimony before this commission, I described the rate inequities that even Piedmont Natural Gas and its filing in this case admitted existed in its rates. Specifically, Piedmont's cost of service study, COSS, showed that large industrial sales service customers were paying over a 40% class rate of return for natural gas service in South Carolina. Similarly, large general firm customers were paying 13% for natural gas service. These class rates of return are grossly excessive in comparison to Piedmont's overall rate of return request of 7.26%. To put this situation in perspective, Piedmont's own COSS stated that its large firm customers and its interruptible customers are paying rates that support a class rates of return that are 2 to 6 times more than Piedmont's own cost of service study. These excessive rates paid by large customers have persisted for over 20 years as the Rate Stabilization Act, RSA, has until this case prevented a complete analysis of Piedmont's rate design. As for the settlement, I support it. I believe the settlement is a good first step in addressing these rate inequities. More, however, needs to be done in this matter to address the rate of return cross-subsidizations, and hopefully Piedmont will come in for a rate case before another 20 years passes. I urge this commission to take strong notice of the interstate natural gas capacity constraints that have now created massive rate hikes in South Carolina. About 2 years ago, natural gas was trading for less than $3 an MMBTU at Zone 5 Transco, which is the delivery point for South Carolina utilities and large transportation customers. This summer, natural gas has been priced on some days as high as $14 an MMBTU due to constraints at Transco Zone 5. This winter, prices are expected to exceed $18 an MMBTU for January and February. The entire country has seen natural gas price increases due to LNG exports required to keep Europe running in light of the decision of Russia to cut off natural gas flows to NATO members. However, these price increases have been greatly exacerbated here in the Carolinas due to the capacity shortages on Transco. We have a very serious issue in the Carolinas that is causing this commission to consider approving massive electric and natural gas fuel increases due in large part to interstate natural gas constraints. I urge this commission to support more natural gas interstate gas capacity into the southeast. This completes my summary.
Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. Would you please answer any questions council or the commission may have?
Yes.
ORS? I'm sorry, Department of Consumer Affairs. Excuse me.
Good afternoon, Mr. O'Donnell. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Very good. My name is Roger Hall, attorney with the Department of Consumer Affairs. I have a few questions for you. Do you have a copy of your testimony with you?
Yeah.
Okay. Just like I mentioned to Mr. Coyne, if you ever need to slow down and take a look at it, let me know. I may be able to also put it on the projector for everyone.
All right.
So the basis for your ROE and capital structure recommendations in your direct is that Piedmont's cost of capital requests are excessive, correct?
No, I did not make any specific cost of capital recommendations. I know that's what Mr. Coyne has said, but if you look at my testimony, I just pulled some numbers and ran my analyses of rate design based upon some pulled numbers. But I did not do a specific cost of capital analysis in this case.
So you are not, your direct testimony does not recommend a 9.3?
No.
Great. Do you recommend a 50-50 capital structure in your testimony?
No, again, what I did was I looked at some analyses that I have done in other states and just pulled some numbers and ran my rate design analysis around these assumed numbers, but I didn't do any cost of capital analysis in this case.
Fair enough. So the 9.3, is that based on what ORS's recommendation was?
Yes.
And I believe you did say this, at least in your testimony, that that would have resulted in a much lower revenue requirement, and hence the Energy Users Committee, their rates would presumably naturally lower because the revenue requirement would be lower.
Yeah, if the overall revenue requirement is lower, then by default, everyone's rates are going to be lower.
Okay. And I don't want to make this assumption, so I'm going to put this on the screen just to confirm here. This is from your exhibit KW01. And I apologize, I'm kind of flipping back and forth, but I'm back to capital structure now. And while you said you didn't make a recommendation, you chose a 50-50 number to discuss, correct?
Yeah, I think it says 50.92.
And I believe your testimony may have rounded or simplified it to 50-50.
Okay.
But in this case, it looks like you did have at least a source for that, and it says here it's the equity ratio is the national average for 2021 obtained from S&P Global Market Intelligence, accessed on July 9th, 2022. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I'm going to show you. This is Mr. Coyne's rebuttal testimony, figure 1 on page 4. And I just wanted to point out here in the right column that 50.92 or 50-50 is close to the 51.58 national average for gas utilities that he references. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And we see there that range. Because if 51.58 is an average, then there's going to be some lower numbers and some higher numbers. But do you agree that range runs from 46.26% to 59.88%?
I haven't checked it myself, but I have no reason to doubt those numbers.
And I'll going to kind of reword my questions here on the fly, understanding that what you're saying is that you weren't necessarily making recommendations. But your rebuttal testimony uses Mr. Rothschild's ROE recommendation to demonstrate that there could be even greater savings to pass on to customers, correct?
Yes.
And you note using Mr. Rothschild's ROE would cut the residential rate hike almost in half, correct?
I didn't do that specific granular analysis on the residential rates.
Bear with me
Oh,
Just-
table one, I'm sorry. Yeah, table one did attempt to, well, that was looking at the overall revenue impact based upon the DCA recommendation, but that is, my rate design recommendation.
but using your rate design, that's right. The substantial difference in the overall revenue requirement using Mr. Rothschild's ROE versus the company's.
Oh, no doubt. It's just a matter of math.
And then also in your SIR rebuttal, you noted that the last South Carolina Public Service Commission litigated case resulted in an ROE of 8.0, correct?
Yes.
And that order was issued December 21st, 2021, as you note in your testimony?
Yes.
You also state that obviously, again, math, 8.0 is well below the recommendations of Piedmont and ORS, which are 9.9 and 9.3 respectively, correct?
Yes.
Reasoning for listing this last rate case to demonstrate that Mr. Rothschild's ROE recommendation of 7.86 is also much closer to the last awarded ROE in South Carolina?
Well, I can't deny that it was in the back of my mind, but I was also trying to see what we could do on the rate design component of it for the folks that I represent.
And I believe this has come up in testimony today already, but are you aware that as Mr. Rothschild testified in his direct testimony that Commonwealth Edison, or ComEd, raised $750 million of first mortgage bonds in March 2022 with an authorized ROE of 7.36 and a capital structure of 48.7?
I have no reason to doubt that. I believe Commonwealth Ed, however, has a formula rate for its ROE calculations.
But nevertheless, that was
Yes.
the ROE at the time.
Yes.
Are you aware that on May 31st of this year, the Commission issued Order 2022-376A, adopting a settlement among the parties in the Kiowa Island Utility Company rate case, in which Kiowa Island Utility Company settled its ROE for 8.69%?
I remember hearing something about that, yes.
And again, basic numbers, but would you agree that the 8.69 Kiowa accepted is less than the upper range of Mr. Rothschild's recommendation, which is 8.74?
Yes.
Do you agree that a company would not accept an 8.69 ROE if they thought it would be detrimental to their ability to raise capital?
As opposed to what? I mean, if they obviously had to make a call as to what they felt like was their best alternative. And if they were still getting some revenues, they may not have got the ROE that they wanted, but if they were still getting some additional revenues, they still get something. So that was a call that they made.
Thank you. No more questions.
Let's see. Thank you, Mr. Hall. Mr. Huber.
No questions for ORS. Thank you.
Mr. Jeffries.
No questions, Madam Chairman.
Commissioners, questions for this witness? Commissioner Williams, I think that's your light.
Yes, ma'am. Good morning, sir. How are you today?
Good afternoon.
Or
Doing good.
this afternoon?
Yeah.
I can't. It's all the time runs together. So help me out here. You did not make a recommendation for ROE.
That's correct.
You did not make a recommendation for capital structure.
That's correct.
All right. So excuse the direct nature of this question, but help me understand the value of your testimony here today.
Rate design.
All right.
That's what I'm here to, that was my testimony, is rate design. Now, maybe Mr. Coyne got me confused because he sees me in a lot of other proceedings, and maybe he was thinking I was doing cost of capital in this case, but I did not make a recommendation in this case.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. It seems as if, though, you do have some opinions or thoughts about cost of capital and return on equity.
I've been testifying as a cost of capital witness for 37 years. I just was not asked to do it here in South Carolina in this case.
Okay. Well, based on what you've seen thus far And based on the case that was brought up, I think it was a December 2021 case. It was a litigated case. I believe that was a water case where there's an 8% return on equity. Does that ring a bell?
Yes.
Did you read that case?
No, I did not. I did not read it in its entirety. I remember talking to my counsel about it.
Okay. What do you know about it other than the return on equity?
That's it.
Okay. Does it matter the utility, water versus natural gas versus electric? Does the service that the utility provide impact the return on equity? Or should all utilities be treated the same?
No, there are slight differences, but not to a great extent. We heard earlier today that the national average rate of return, I think it was Mr. Coyne said it was 9.54 for electric, and then for gas it was like 9.38. And I've pulled some numbers for water utilities, and the national average is, I think, somewhere down around 9.25 or so. So if you look at the comparable earnings analysis that folks like Mr. Coyne and I do, what regulators around the country say based upon these national averages is that there is not much of a difference. And then if you look at what the market says, it's really quite fascinating because the dividend yields for water utilities are pretty low. And I think the reason for that is because a lot of them are being bought up now by folks who want to have greater yields in their portfolios and so forth. So the quick answer is, does it make a difference? Yes. A large difference? No.
Based on what you've done in this case prior to your testimony and what you heard up to this point, do you believe that the consumer advocates experts' recommendation on ROE is just and reasonable?
Well, first, support the settlement. I have to say no.
It's not just and reasonable.
No.
Okay.
In my opinion. I'm sorry to Mr. Rothschild, but in my opinion, no.
Okay. I mean, it's okay for it not to be. You seem to be struggling over answering that question.
I spent 37 years representing consumers, so this is a little bit hard one for me to take and to say, but I couldn't go there.
Okay. Thank you. So why don't you believe it's just and reasonable?
For some of the reasons supported by Mr. Coyne, it's so far below the national. The numbers don't make sense. I haven't read the details of his testimony, and I've seen Mr. Rothschild in other jurisdictions as well. But there's a sense of those of us that are in the industry, when the numbers get that low, that they're, in my opinion, not believable.
Okay, thank you. Give me 1 second here. Okay, we want to flesh this out a little bit more in terms of not being believable. So, stated another way, Mr. Rothschild's numbers lack credibility. Is that simply because it's too low, or is there something wrong with his method?
I haven't studied his method, so I really won't comment on that. But yeah, I mean, they go below a certain threshold. I have trouble understanding them, believing them, and I do believe that there is something in regard to the Hope Bluefield standard. I can't necessarily give a range on that Hope and Bluefield standard, but when the national average is 9.4 and you're at 7.86, with all due respect, that doesn't make sense to me. There has been, let me expand a little bit more, excuse me. There has been, nothing has happened in the economy over the course of the past 6 months to make such a dramatic difference in the allowed rates of return to go from 9.3, whatever it is, down to 7.86. If something dramatically happened, you know, if the market jumped 30%, okay, well, then you start looking at the numbers and saying, well, maybe 786 is the right number, but there hasn't been anything like that. So I know that utility regulators and myself being a former member of the public staff of North Carolina Utilities Commission, we like to do things gradually, but to go from a national average of 9.3 to 7.86 is a massive drop at one time.
Understood. So I just want to use your expertise to better understand what happened in December, because Mr. I'm blanking on the consumer advocate's name. No, not Mr. Rothschild, the lawyer. Hall, Mr. Hall. Sorry, Attorney Hall. Attorney Hall asked you about the case in December, and the RE was 8%, and you said nothing has changed drastically in 6 months. We're in the 8th month. Did something drastically change between December and August?
No.
No.
I just know the 8% was the allowed ROE. I don't know the details behind it.
Based on what you do know, do you think that was just and reasonable?
No.
Okay. I'm going to take a break. Madam Chair, I don't have any questions for now, right now.
Thank you. Commissioners?
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Caston?
She looked at me with a sly grin. I don't want to plow the same ground, but I want to get it right too. And to my knowledge, I've never been accused of violating a federal Supreme Court ruling. And I must be honest, even though your job is to do what you do, and I'm sure you do it well, or you wouldn't be sitting where you are, nor would Mr. Coyne. But I'm still struggling. The absoluteness of, if it's not equal to or better than the average, whatever rate of return, then it violates Hope, Bluefield, and probably a host of other things and I'm really struggling with that. Can you help me get to a better place, or like, why, just because you said that, and then I'm not, accusing you of just saying that, is that has become an absolute gospel rather than, well, still, are there mitigating circumstances?
Yeah, let me answer it this way. There is no strict standard on the Hope and Bluefield case that I'm aware of. It says it has to be comparable. So if you look at the rates of return that have been granted across the country over the past 15 years, you've seen a downward trend. So if this commission came out and granted lower than what's in the stipulation, which I support, I'm not a lawyer, okay? First and foremost, my E&O insurance doesn't pay for that. But I think you'd still be safe if you granted something above the 949, 20, 30 basis points above, or 20, 30 basis points below. There have been commissions that have granted electric utilities 8.75 about 3 years ago. That was well below the national average at that time. I don't don't even know what the FERC is allowing in terms of returns right now. So in any event, there is no absolute. In other words, my personal opinion is that if you decide to grant 9.50 instead of 9.49, I don't think someone has a case against you at the Supreme Court for violating Hope and Bluefield. I got some well-paid folks behind me. They can answer that better than I can. But I typically recommend numbers that are not at the national average. And if we take nothing away from that, at least for the balance of my career, I hope that everyone knows that I'm not recommending we always go to the national. I'm not, because I do my own analyses and I typically come out lower than the national.
And I'm not trying to set you up here, but I really want to know if you really believe one way or the other. You said if it were 9.5, fine. If it were 9, what if it's 9.0?
My personal opinion is that it's still within the ballpark. 10.0, still in the ballpark. You know, you get, but when you start talking about 150 basis points or so away from the national average, then that's when I start worrying about maybe violating Hope and Bluefield and possibly getting an appeal.
And when you're talking about the national average, you're not just talking about, as Mr. Coyne had, these 6 utilities in the proxy group. Are you talking about all utilities, water, wastewater, electric, everybody?
Well, it's done by industry, so it's electric, gas, water. And you can find them by going into Regulatory Research Associates. They provide those on a quarterly basis. So it's all the rate cases that have been heard and adjudicated over the past year.
Okay, I want to make sure, I mean, because you shook your head, and I'm not sure what you said yes to. The national average of the proxy group or all gas?
All
Okay.
gas utilities. You can find them on Regulatory Research Associates, all the cases, and you can sum up the returns and average it out.
So looking at just an average, not just what's in our region or in South Carolina, but we got to consider Alaska, we got to consider Utah, Oregon, California, and you know, you may have one way over here and one way down here, and you still get the average?
Yes, because investors don't really, well, investors care where the gas utility is, they care about its operating characteristics, but at the end, they still want to get the best investment that they can, so I look at all of them. Alaska, Maine, Florida, and everything in between.
Of course, I can't find what I'm looking for because I was trying to look for that Hope Bluefield section again. I'm just fascinated by that, so I'm not trying to beat it to death. But the way it describes it, where it really doesn't, I mean, the Supreme Court didn't really say, you know, you need to find that national average, or you need to be this much below it or above it. I didn't read that into that. So if I looked across the country and I found whatever gas companies, who's to say what's comparable? And one was 7.2. One was 15.5. Well, does it have to be right in the middle of that, or could it be 7.2 or 15.5?
Well, the difference there is you're talking about 2.
Correct.
The reality is you're going to have as many as 40 gas cases either settled or adjudicated in a given year. So you have a pretty strong average in those numbers. But again, I mean, I use it's called the comparable earnings analysis. I'm not certain which witness, if any of them, used the comparable earnings in this case. But it's important to do your numbers, do the DCF model, and then do the CAPM, and then look at the comparable earnings. So again, I don't want to leave here with y'all thinking that Kevin says use the national average. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, as a former utility witness used to say, you have to do the smell test, and you have to see if what you're recommending smells right in light of other available investments in the market. Because if all you do is follow the average from one year to the next, and you're flat. So when the utility, if and when interest rates ever go up again, then the utility is going to be hurting because their rate of return is going to be flat. They can't increase it. And the same is true when interest rates go down. Well, we want the consumers to feel the benefit of that as well. So that's the reason why you see over time the trend has been downward for the past 15 years for all utilities, and I think it will continue for a little bit longer.
Do you believe there's a time, and I'm not saying now's the time, I'm not even implying this, but there's a time when the conventional becomes the unconventional, or the unconventional becomes the conventional?
I'm not certain how to respond to that. I'm sorry.
All right, let me try. The way things have always been done, does that ever change?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, every time we come into a case, I do an analysis. And I may recommend 875 in one part of the country and 95 in another part of the country. In fact, Mr. Coyne and Mr. Rothschild are both involved in a case in California where I just recommended 9.5 for two utilities out there. Why? Because it's California. It had nothing to do with the national average. It had everything to do with wildfire risk and inverse condemnation. So that's higher than what I would normally recommend. But it was California. Totally different than anywhere else.
Agreed. And that kind of gets me to another question, in that when I think about these 40 gas companies, or however many there are, and I know, nothing about the majority of them, and I have absolutely zero reason to doubt that Piedmont is nothing but a well-run company. But I don't really know that. But I know absolutely nothing about the others. I mean, they could be incredibly poorly run. Just spending all kind of money that's not needed to be spent, but you put them in that group and you kind of get these averages, kind of like I'd ask about the proxy group. Has it never concerned you, and maybe it doesn't, that it's a circle of comparison, kind of we're perpetuating what we believe?
It has. I think I brought that up a few minutes ago. You have to be careful about that, because if something happens in the markets and all you do is go with the average, then you're right, it's circular reasoning. You don't want to do that. But nonetheless, whatever you do come out with in your analysis, you still have to compare it to what the national average is to see if it makes sense. Now, if I come up with a number and it's 9.0 and I look at the national average and it's 9.5, I'll say, okay, that's reasonable. If my analysis comes out 8 and the national average is 9.5, I'm going to say, I'm going to go back and study that a little bit further. Something doesn't sound right to me.
Okay. Switch gears on you, if you don't mind, quickly on your testimony. You indicated that Transco Zone 5 is highly constrained, and I believe that's the part of Transco line that runs through the upper part of South Carolina, correct?
Correct.
And when you say it's highly constrained, what do you mean by that?
Okay. Well, I could spend all day talking about that nightmare, but I'll try to be to the point. I believe it was Duke Progress who filed a fuel increase of, I think it was 13% recently for residential customers, and a 24% on industrials. I believe Dominion filed a fuel case where, when I say these numbers, I'm talking about overall rate increases. I think Dominion's was in excess of 20% for the industrial customers. I represent a number of municipalities in North Carolina where I personally have gone before the boards and recommended rate hikes as high as 30%. The reason is because natural gas is constrained at Zone 5. We have 1.9 BCF of gas a day coming south into Virginia from Marcellus. And that's basically eaten up in Virginia by large electric plants. And then Transco runs both ways. So when you go south to north, the problem you've got there is we got a compressor station 60 that has been in and out of service since June of this year. So at a time when Transco is normally not constrained, where prices, capacity prices we call basis, is normally about 50 cents an MMBTU. It's been as high as $8 an MMBTU this summer. So when well, it's really electric utilities. When electric utilities come before you now and say, hey, I need a big 20, 30% rate hike, that's why. It's Russia and it's Ukraine. Absolutely, it's that. But the other part of this is the Carolinas, we are hemmed in by one interstate pipeline, at least in North Carolina. Very little capacity left on it. I'm hoping and praying the Mountain Valley is completed because you never quite live before you go before a town board and recommend a 30% rate increase in a town where the average income is maybe $25,000. Very painful. I've been there and I know what y'all deal with on a regular basis because of that.
So what I'm hearing is the constraint sounds like it's supply and demand, and the pipe's not big enough to carry all you need to where you want it, and there's too many people wanting it, and they're not all here. And
it's all that, but the pipe's not big enough. There's not enough compressor stations around. There's not another interstate pipeline. We almost had Atlantic Coast Pipeline. It was stopped. Duke and Dominion canceled it after weathering some pretty intense lawsuits. Mountain Valley, we're hoping will relieve some of that congestion, because not only does that bring, I think it's 2 BCF a day of capacity into northern North Carolina, that will then free up more capacity here in South Carolina, but it also will add another 436,000 DTs a day with a looping that is going to take place in the northern part of North Carolina. So Mountain Valley is very important to the Carolinas, extremely important, because if we don't have more gas expansion, then the rate increases that the electric utilities are coming before you right now, they're going to become permanent.
well, that's not what this hearing's about relative to the gas pipelines, but I've heard something similar repeatedly in different hearings by Dominion also. And you answered my question. I was going to ask you now, why are there not more pipelines?
Environmental lawsuits.
And you believe because of these lawsuits, investors in gas companies such as Piedmont and Dominion and others aren't constructing these lines, and these folks that own these interstate lines, and that also affects the cost the consumer and customer is paying for gas because of this.
Absolutely, but it's not that utilities aren't trying. Duke and Dominion tried to build the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, but they were stopped by the environmentalists. And, you know, in all due respect, I don't want my environmental friends to get too upset with me, even though they probably already are. But their belief is that no more fossil fuels, nowhere, no how. whereas I represent a number of small towns where they've got to get the bridge fuel before we can go to windmills and solar panels. It has to be used as a bridge to get to that point.
You answered my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commissioners? Commissioner Carolee Williams?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. O'Donnell.
Good afternoon.
Did I give you an extra O? I did.
No, it's okay.
I didn't. Okay.
Yeah, no, you do good.
Long day. You at the bottom of page 9, and you don't need to look at it. You really talk about the rate inequities that have been allowed to compound over the past 2 decades. I wanted to give you a chance to expand on that in your testimony.
Thank you. So what's going on here, and the reason I filed this testimony was because we haven't had a rate case in South Carolina from Piedmont in over 20 years. So when you looked at their cost of service study in this case by Ms. Cousins, the class rates of return were stunning. 40% for interruptible transportation. I think it's 30-some% for interruptible sales, and then about 13% for firm service, 203 and 204 customers. So when you look at that, anyone who's ever done any rate design cost of service study knows you got to fix that, because that's just not right. Those customers are subsidizing other customers, and you can't do that. A, it's not right. B, that's going to lead to some economic problems down the road. And I can tell you, I've had industrial location firms call me in the past, and if they tell me that they're heavy natural gas users, I will tell them, you need to be careful about the Carolinas, specifically South Carolina, because these transportation rates are on the high side, just to give them a heads up. But they need to be addressed. Ms. Cousins' cost of service study was pretty good. The results speak for themselves. So my rate design was based upon her cost of service study.
For the record, who is subsidizing whom?
Large customers, based upon the results of her cost of service study, are subsidizing residential and small general service customers.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
No further questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioners, further questions?
Madam Chair.
Commissioner J. Williams?
Thank you, ma'am. All right, Mr. O'Donnell, I had a chance to catch my breath here. I'm trying to get a better understanding of the basis in which this commission makes ROE findings. I think we owe it to all our stakeholders, all the parties here, ratepayers at every level, interested parties across the world, to be clear in how and why we reach our conclusions. And I think it's been discussed by some of my fellow colleagues that it seems to be a bit nebulous at times. We understand some of the arguments, but the reason I needed to catch my breath is that not so long ago, in December, this commission found an 8% ROE was just and reasonable. I think that ROE was offered by Mr. Rothschild, and now here we are, and there are arguments against what Mr. Rothschild is arguing for. You've argued on behalf of consumers for a long time, and you struggled. You actually turned a different shade. Struggled to say, no, it wasn't just and reasonable, and you don't think that what the commission found in December of 2021 was just and reasonable. you're here just to give your observations, your opinion as an expert. How can the commission be more consistent in their RE findings, whether it's on the low, high end, or somewhere in between?
I'll tell you a quick story, and hopefully this will help you understand where I come from. So I was trained undergrad as an engineer. You know, A plus B equals C. Then I went and got my MBA, and that's when a whole lot of subjectivity comes into matters, because I went from being an engineer to a financial analyst. Subjectivity is the key. You have to figure out what you feel personally is right. There's not any formula available that you can plug the numbers into, and this is what you get. At least not here in South Carolina. In Illinois, the ComEd case that was mentioned earlier today, that's a formula rate. But there is no formula rate here in South Carolina or in most other states I work at involving return on equity. So you have to use your own judgment. So when I said earlier, was the 786 and the 80 just and reasonable, I was giving my opinion. And my opinion, they're not. So what I have seen, and now I'm going to try to be a lawyer here, and if anyone objects, please stop me. But what I have seen when cases are appealed at higher levels, they're basically kicked back to the utilities commissions and said to give more underpinnings for the reasons. In other words, I've seen some states go as far as saying, well, the dividend yield in the comparable group was 4, and we believe the growth is 5.5%. Well, according to the DCF, then the rate of return is 9.5, and that's how we came up with it. And if that's how they came up with it, it's probably going to stand a test in the courts. Being more analytical, I think, in terms of court defense, is better than being less analytical. So I hope I answered your question, but the bottom line is everything that we do here in rate of return is a matter of opinion.
I understand that, and I appreciate you indulging me in answering my questions. Another thing I've struggled with is what I consider somewhat of a doomsday scenario painted if this commission in any rate case goes too low. And we've heard it here with the first witness, that the credit rating will decrease, that will cause the cost of debt to increase, and that ultimately that increased cost would be passed to the ratepayer. Is that the general thought?
Yeah, but it's a lot deeper than that. With all due respect to Mr. Coyne, that's been a bogus argument used by utility witnesses for many, many years. Because what happens is that, first of all, there's no guarantee that the credit is going to be downgraded, because there are a lot of factors that go into utility credit downgrade. But then once you run the numbers out, typically what I have found is a ratio of $8 to 1. So if a utility wants $8 of extra funds for its equity return, they want a higher equity return, then that equates to about $1 on the higher debt cost. So basically what I'm saying is that argument, first of all, you don't know that it's going to be a downgrade, number one. And then second of all, it makes no sense to pay $8 to save $1. And in the California testimony I just filed, I'm certain Mr. Coyne's already been working on it, trying to combat that same argument that I just raised, that it makes no sense to give them a higher rate of return and pay that $8 so you can save that $1. It just doesn't make any sense. Now, that said, you don't want the utility to be sitting there at a BBB- bond rating when you have a hurricane sitting off the coast and they have to raise capital in a real big hurry to put the poles back up. You got to find that middle ground somewhere. You know, something more than a triple B minus where it's sitting close to junk bond, and something less than an A plus. You've got to find that middle ground somewhere in there, and that's just a subjective matter that regulators around the country deal with.
And so, considering all of that, I understand you're here with the Energy Users Committee, but I think you have enough experience, correct me if I'm wrong, with all customer classes. Just looking at it from Joe Ratepayer's perspective, with the commission sitting in the place of the market, should we not seek to find a ROE based on the evidence presented to us that hits the proper balance, allows the utility to recover a fair rate of return, but also limits the cost to customers?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
That's the dance that we do.
And so when you look at what happened in December with that 8.0 ROE, the world, to my knowledge, the world didn't end. I think the utility is still offering service. To Joe Ratepayer, it may seem reasonable, even in this case, to again support Mr. Rothschild's recommendation in order to have a lower bill each month. I mean, again, we're talking about Joe Ratepayer, not necessarily very smart and knowledgeable about their personal finances, but maybe not an expert in the field of utility regulation. How do we justify not going along with that line of thinking?
No, I get it. I mean, like I was saying a few minutes ago, I'm currently sitting where y'all are sitting when I'm coming before a municipal board and recommending a 30% rate hike because natural gas is at Transco Zone 5 is ugly, and I'm just dealing with folks that average income is $25,000 a year. So, you know, it's painful. I mean, it's awful to do that, to go before a board. And during lunch today, I was on the phone to a citizen of one of my towns because they need an extension on paying their power bill. Of course, I didn't have any control over that, but they didn't know how to pay their bill. So I get it, you know, I understand it. But at the same time, utilities are owned and operated, and these poles outside the office here and gas lines, they're owned by other people. They're owned by investors, and we have to compensate them fairly in order to continue to supply the utility services. Because the last thing I want is to be without gas service on a really wickedly cold day. I don't want another Texas to occur, you know, Winter Storm Uri. So I want the utilities to continue to invest. I want them to continue to attract capital. And I think the ROE in this case will give them that.
To that point, your client, Energy Users Committee, the applicant Piedmont, Office of Regulatory Staff believes, the expert believes, that 9.49 return in equity will allow the utility to continue to operate and continue to provide outstanding service to its customers.
Yes.
And Mr. Rothschild's recommended ROE 7.86 would not.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. O'Donnell. It's good to see you again. It's been a while.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Mr. O'Donnell, you're here, and the main purpose of your testimony is rate design. And I understand that that you're here with the Energy Users Committee, but you have reviewed the rate design are the rates for all classes of customers in this proceeding?
Yes.
Based on your experience, does the settlement agreement fairly allocate revenues to the various rate design or classes of customers?
Yes, they do.
Do you consider this a fair rate design?
Yes, I do.
And that would be the rate design based on the stipulated 9.49 ROE?
Yes.
And based on your direct testimony, would it be fair to say that using the requested, what Piedmont requested as ROE, would that have resulted in fair rates and rate design?
No.
Okay. And based on your experience, is the recommendation of witness Rothschild, does that result in fair rates or rate design?
No.
And can you tell me why?
The 786 is, in my opinion, unreasonable to Piedmont. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think my clients probably like the lower number, but I don't think it's reasonable to Piedmont. And then in terms of Mr. Coyne's recommendation, again, it's not reasonable. It's too high.
Okay. Thank you very much. Commissioners, anything further for this witness? Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. O'Donnell.
Good afternoon.
So let me ask you a question about rate design. And you mentioned that it had been 20 years since the last rate case, and that you hoped that that would never happen again. And it looks to me like the stipulation kind of says, well, they won't file for 5 years. I'm not sure I'm reading it exactly correctly, but it's kind of the way I'm looking at it. But help me understand how the rate design gets out of whack over time. What causes that?
I'm fixing to get myself in trouble again. It was 20 years ago. It was not set properly, in my opinion. 20 years ago, we had something called full margin transportation rates in the Carolinas. So in North Carolina, about 20 years ago, I was retained to look at transportation rates across the country. And this is a very old study, but at the top of the list in terms of the most expensive transportation rates was South Carolina at like $1.20 MMBTU or something to that degree. And North Carolina was, number 3. And it was because of the full margin transportation rates. Other states attacked this issue long ago. South Carolina did not because of the Rate Stabilization Act. Because the RSA, in my opinion, does not necessarily protect the consumer. It protects the gas utility. Because they don't have to have a rate case. They just adjust their margins and the rates go up or they go down. But the allocation of the cost of the overall revenue increase is going to stay the same amongst the various customer classes. So I think the problem evolved from 20 years ago, and it just never got addressed, just to be honest about it. I think that's probably what happened.
So it's more about a problem that happened at the beginning and not related so much to the passage of time. Is that
I think that's what happened.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioners, anything further? Is there any redirect?
No redirect, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Madam Chairwoman, if I may, I would like to request a very brief additional cross-examination of Mr. O'Donnell based on the limited new information and testimony elicited during Commissioner Jay Williams' questions, as well as his testimony about the settlement in general. He has not yet submitted any settlement testimony, so I believe there's new matters that I'd just like a very few brief questions about, please.
It's a bit out of the ordinary, but I think we generally allow some limited cross on commissioner questions. So, Mr. Hall, please go ahead.
But Madam Chair, on commissioner questions, I'm happy to accommodate. I don't understand the settlement point he makes.
Mr. Elliott, they cannot hear you in the back.
I'm happy to accommodate Mr. Hall for limited redirect on the commissioner questions. I didn't understand the reasoning behind the settlement. I think he was questioned about the settlement. I think he said in his summary he supported the settlement. I'm not sure where he wants to go there. I don't want to limit him, but I may retain my objection.
Mr. Hall, please remember that cross is limited to new material. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. Mr. O'Donnell, you were asked if you believe the 7.86 results were reasonable or fair and reasonable, and you stated no. Do you have the same opinion about the 8.74 that is the upper range of Mr. Rothschild's recommendations?
Well, considering I recommended 8.75, I think it was in Maryland probably about a year and a half ago, I'd have to say it's probably within that bound of reasonableness.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you about that case, as a matter of fact. You also stated, though, in your response to Jay Williams, Commissioner Jay Williams, excuse me, formality, that results that low are not believable or something to that effect. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you remember what your model results were in that case in Maryland?
Oh, Lord, no. I'm sorry. That was quite a long time ago.
Well, let me just ask you, make sure we're talking about the same case. Maybe it's District of Columbia, a Pepco case?
It could be.
That opinion came out in around June of 2021.
Okay.
And I'm going to read to you from, and pardon me, Madam Chair, I only have the Lexis citation for this case, but since that's all I have, I will note it. It is 2021 PUC Lexis 77. This is around page 166. This is from the order, and it says, based on these results, he believes that the DCF growth rate should be in the range of 4 to 6%. His DCF range is 6.9 to 9.0. Minister O'Donnell also confirms the same DCF analysis using Diacentis proxy group. That DCF range is 6.8 to 9.0. Does that sound vaguely familiar?
Vaguely.
The opinion continues, Mr. O'Donnell's CAPM result is 4.04 to 6.49, using an equity risk premium of 4 to 6%. Does that sound accurate?
That sounds right, but that's right there is the reason why I don't put a whole lot in the CAPM. And I say that in my testimony as well.
Continuing, his midpoints from his DCF and CAPM analysis are 8.0 and 6.5% respectively. O'Donnell recommends a higher 8.75% ROE in recognition of the higher allowed ROEs from across the country. Is that the 8.75 you're referring to?
Yeah, and I think that's pretty well consistent with what I've been saying today, and that is you run your numbers, and then you look at what the national average is, and then you figure it out from there.
So in that case, did you believe that your results were so low to not be reasonable?
Some of the numbers, yes.
And therefore, and that's why you recommended an 8.75?
Yes.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Commissioners, anything further?
Madam
Commissioner
Chair.
Williams?
So I got to complete the circle on that, Mr. O'Donnell. Now, I was focusing on the lows and not the highs of Mr. Rothschild's range in this case. So is it your testimony that return on equity of 8.74, I believe is the number, is fair and reasonable? I know you're supporting the settlement.
Yeah.
I get that. I just want to know if do you opine that 8.74 is fair and reasonable and will allow Piedmont to provide the same outstanding service to their customers that they provided thus far?
I'm struggling with that because 8.75, I believe, but I'm not certain would be the lowest ROE granted by any state regulator in the last year. That's number one. More importantly, the market has fallen dramatically this year. Interest rates have gone up. So I wouldn't be recommending 874, 875 in DC anymore. That was a different time. Right now, I would probably say that number is unreasonable. I wouldn't feel comfortable testifying to it, put to you that way.
Right, I understand that, but I just want to, it's not, your testimony is that 8.74 is not fair and reasonable.
At this point, no.
All right. No further questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioners. Commissioner Caston?
Okay, I want to make sure I understand all that too. In, I guess, the cross of Mr. Hall, I thought I heard you say that, when you mentioned 8.75 or 74 or something, that it was in, I think you said, the bounds of reasonableness.
At that time. In other words, this was 2 years ago.
Okay.
Look at what the market has done is it's down 20%. When the market's down, the dividend yield on the DCF goes up. So our discussion earlier about circularness, that's why you do your analysis every time, because the cost of capital changes over time. 875 was reasonable then. It's not now.
Okay. I understand. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I thought I heard, and I guess the transcript would say what it said, is when you were asked that question, I thought you said it was in the bounds of reasonableness. Considering I did a 8 whatever it was in Maryland about a year ago or something like that. I thought that's what I heard. And I'm not saying that you're saying, yes, it ought to be 8.75.
No, I conflicted myself. I'm sorry about that. Again, at this point in time, I don't think it's reasonable. I'm sorry. If I answer that way to the DCA attorney, I'm sorry, I misspoke. I don't think that it's reasonable at this point in time.
Again, I'm not, and I don't think Commissioner Williams or anyone, I'm not trying to paint you in a corner. I'm not trying to get you to commit to anything.
No.
Because frankly, I'm trying to, get a grip on that bounds of reasonableness.
Right.
You'd mentioned 9. Well, that's in that range. Would it be 8.9? Would it be 8.78? Would it be 8.8? And I'm just.
I understand. I just go back to that time. You're talking earlier today about how you calculate a circle. I was an engineer, then I go to finance. It's hard. Judgment is hard, whereas engineering and math is very straightforward.
I'm glad you said that out loud. Y'all remember that. Thank you. And even an engineer, we do have to make assumptions, and you want it to be the best you can on population projections and all. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner Caston. Commissioners? Okay. Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. We appreciate your appearance today. You're excused.
Thank you.
Thank you. Quite literally, I think he's got.
I understand. It's at your peril, though.
Yeah.
We're going to take a short break, but before we do, who's going to be our next witness?
Mr. Baldino will be.
And is he virtual?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so we'll take until, what is it? I can't even look at my phone. Gee whiz. I thought I knew how to work a clock. Hang on, wrong phone. It's 3:40. Let's come back at 3:55. That'll give our folks in the back chance to have a short break and then get him on virtually. A few minutes to do that. So 3:55, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the Public Service Commission for the continuation of the hearing in docket number 2022-89G. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carolee Williams, Commissioner Caston, Chair Belser, and appearing virtually we have Commissioner Urban. Recognize Mr. Huber from the Office of Regulatory Staff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. ORS calls Richard A. Baldino.
Mr. Baldino, I believe you're appearing virtually.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Baldino, will you raise your right hand and be sworn, please? Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Baldino, will you please state your full name for the record?
Yes, it's Richard A. Baldino.
And Mr. Baldino, by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm a consultant with the firm of J. Kennedy and Associates, Inc.
Madam Chair, pursuant to the stipulation the parties agreed to, parties have stipulated to Mr. Baldino as an expert in capital structure, cost of capital, and the financial analysis of regulated utilities, and I'd ask the Commission to accept that proffer.
We will accept Mr. Baldino as an expert in the areas you've identified.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Baldino, are you the same Richard Baldino who pre-filed 45 pages of direct testimony in this proceeding on July 12th, 2022?
Yes, I am.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your direct testimony?
I do not.
If I asked you the same questions today as those posed in your direct testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Madam Chair, I move that the pre-filed direct testimony of Richard Baldino be entered into the record of the case as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Baldino's direct pre-filed testimony will be entered into the record as if read from the stand.
Mr. Baldino, did you also prepare or cause to be prepared 4 exhibits marked as Exhibit RAB1 through RAB4 that accompanied your pre-filed direct testimony?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to those exhibits?
I do not.
Madam Chair, I move that Mr. Baldino's exhibits marked as Exhibit RAB1 through RAB4 be marked as a composite hearing exhibit and entered into the record of this case.
Mr. Baldino's pre-filed direct exhibits RAB1 through RAB4 will be marked for identification as hearing exhibit number 6 and received into the evidence of this case.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Baldino, did you also pre-file 17 pages of rebuttal testimony in this proceeding on August 5th, 2022?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your rebuttal testimony?
No, I do not.
And if I asked you the same questions today as those posed in your rebuttal testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Madam Chair, I move that the pre-filed rebuttal testimony of Richard Baldino be entered into the record of this case as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Baldino's pre-filed rebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Baldino, did you also prepare or cause to be prepared 3 exhibits marked as rebuttal exhibit RAB1 through rebuttal exhibit RAB3 that accompanied your pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your exhibits?
I do not.
Madam Chair, I move that Mr. Baldino's exhibits marked as rebuttal exhibit RAB1 through rebuttal exhibit RAB3 be marked as a composite hearing exhibit and entered into the record of the case.
Mr. Baldino's pre-filed rebuttal exhibits RAB1 through RAB3 will be a composite exhibit marked for identification as hearing exhibit 7 and entered into the record of this case.
Mr. Baldino, are you aware the parties have entered into a stipulation under which Piedmont, South Carolina Energy Users Committee, and ORS agree to an authorized return on equity of 9.49% and a capital structure consisting of 53.5% equity?
Yes, I'm aware that those are 2 elements of a comprehensive settlement that's signed by the parties.
Do you agree this ROE and capital structure are reasonable in the context of the comprehensive stipulation into which parties have entered?
Yes, definitely.
Mr. Baldino, have you prepared a summary of your testimony?
Yes, I have.
Will you please present that summary to the commission?
Certainly. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and Commissioners. My name is Richard Baldino, as we've stated. I'm a consultant with the firm J. Kennedy and Associates, and I've been retained by the Office of Regulatory Staff in this proceeding to evaluate the cost of equity and debt capital, as well as the appropriate capital structure for Piedmont Natural Gas Company. My direct testimony addresses the company's proposed authorized return on equity, or ROE, and capital structure in response to the direct testimony of company witnesses, Mr. James Coyne and Mr. Chris Bauer. My surrebuttal testimony responds to Mr. Coyne's rebuttal to me and addresses Mr. Bauer's rebuttal regarding capital structure. In my direct testimony, I analyzed and made recommendations on the appropriate cost of equity and return on equity for Piedmont based on current market conditions, as well as the company's proposed capital structure and cost of debt. In his direct testimony, Mr. Coyne recommended an ROE of 9.9% for Piedmont. He also supported the company's request for approval of a capital structure consisting of 54.56% equity. Mr. Bauer also presented testimony supporting Piedmont's proposed capital structure and requested 54.56 equity ratio. Now, my ROE analyses in my direct testimony support an ROE of no more than 9.3% for Piedmont. My analyses and recommendations are based on the widely used models, the discounted cash flow model and the capital asset pricing model. Also presented an update in my surrebuttal testimony, which suggests the investor required ROE for Piedmont and for the gas proxy group declined slightly since I filed my direct testimony. So, but anyway, based on these analyses, the ORS continues to recommend a 9.3% ROE for Piedmont in my testimony. With respect to the proposed capital structure, I recommended in my testimony the Commission approve a 52.2% common equity ratio and a debt ratio of 47.8%. This is the capital structure that the Commission recently approved in the company's most recent Rate Stabilization Act docket, number 2021-7-G. This capital structure supports Piedmont's current stable investment-grade credit ratings from both Standard & Poor's and Moody's rating agencies. As for the cost of debt, I make no adjustment to the company's proposed 4.08% in my testimony. My adjustments to the company's proposed ROE and capital structure, including the 4.08% cost of debt, resulted in an overall weighted cost of average cost of capital of 6.80%. And this concludes my summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baldino. Mr. Baldino is now available for questions from the parties and the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Huber. Mr. Elliott.
No questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I usually do interveners and come to the company last, but I understand the settlement agreement, so I'm going to go with Mr. Jeffries.
No questions for Mr. Baldino, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Hall.
Good afternoon, Mr. Baldino. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. And good afternoon to you as well.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? I know sometimes it's a little difficult when we're in person and you're virtual.
I can hear you just fine. Thanks for asking.
Great. I also assume you probably have your testimony with you. I will be using the overhead here occasionally if needed for the benefit of the commission. Not sure if you can see, we'll be able to see that or not. But so again, like I've said to other witnesses, please just stop me if you need to find your spot in your testimony.
Mr. Hall, when you use the overhead, I believe that they will put that on the screen so that the witness can see it. At that point, we will not be able to see the witness, however.
Okay,
And so there will be a change so that the court reporter can see the witness when she needs to.
okay, I guess, if the commission would like to see something on the overhead, maybe I'll just maybe make sure to take my time and so you all can see it and see the witness at the same.
I think if you refer to where you are in the testimony, I think we'll be able to follow.
Okay,
If
great.
not, we will let you know. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Baldini, I think you covered a couple of my questions already in your summary, but just to make sure, your 52.2% recommendation is the same as what was authorized by the commission in the last RSA case. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That capital structure was the result of a settlement between ORS and Piedmont, correct?
Right, that was a settlement.
And as far as you know, would this capital structure that's authorized in this case continue every year in each RSA case unless another settlement is reached?
I'm not sure. I believe it would. I'm not sure of that, but I assume that it would.
I'm guessing you may not know this, but I'll go ahead and ask. Same with the ROE, it would continue in every RSA case unless a settlement is reached, correct?
I believe that's the case.
Thank you.
Yes.
And you noted this as well in your summary, I believe, but you note in your testimony on direct page 30 that this 52.2% equity structure has supported the company's stable investment grade credit ratings from S&P and Moody's, correct?
Which page in my testimony?
Yes, sir. Page 30.
30. Okay, I misunderstood you. Hold on just a minute. Let me get to that.
And I will go ahead and tell you it is lines 2 through 4.
Okay. Yes, that's correct.
On page 29 of your testimony, you list the 2020 and 2021 averages of the proxy group that all three ROE witnesses in this proceeding used. Is that correct?
Yes.
And on table 2 on page 29 that the 2020 average was 48.9% equity and the 2021 average was 44.6% equity. Is that correct?
That's right.
And that 2021 average is essentially the same as Mr. Rothschild's 44.58% recommendation. Would you agree?
Yes.
On page 31, you list Piedmont's per books equity ratios from 2017 to 2022. And you note that the 2017 to 2021 average was 51.9% equity, correct?
2017 to 2021, yes, 51.9, that's correct.
And the average over all 6 of those years was 52.34, is that right?
Yes.
On page 32, you also note the 54.5% equity requested by the company is 200 basis points higher than the six-year average and will lead to higher rates for customers, correct?
Right. That's correct.
And all else being equal, increasing the company's current 52.2% equity structure would result in higher rates for customers, correct?
Well, it would, and I did point that out, and it would be an unnecessary increase in rates for customers because the company does not need that kind of equity ratio to maintain its credit ratings.
And yeah, and anything above 52.2 will result in higher rates, all else being equal.
All else being equal, yes. Now, of course, we've got a comprehensive settlement here, in which we've agreed to 53.5%. Now, within the context of the settlement, I support that. And that represents the give and take that the parties had in the whole settlement negotiation process. So, I can't make a flat statement that anything above 52.2% is not reasonable. That number is, will, other things being equal, result in higher rates than a 52.2% equity ratio. But again, within the context of the global settlement or comprehensive settlement, I recommend that. I support that.
But you understand the Department of Consumer Affairs joined in all the other aspects of the settlement, but for return on equity and capital structure. You understand that, right?
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you a little bit about your CAPM ROE estimate.
Okay.
Specifically looking at pages 26 of your direct testimony. In the summary, you state that your forward-looking CAPM ROE estimate is 14.91%, correct?
That's right.
And your CAPM based on historical risk premiums range from 8.68 to 9.67%, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
But you recommend that the commission not consider your forward-looking CAPM ROE of 14.91 because I believe in your words it is implausibly high. Is that right?
That's right. That's clearly an outlier. It's been, I didn't look through the history of allowed ROEs. I did look through the history of allowed ROEs that Mr. Coyne presented, and going through that right now. As far as the average quarterly ROEs he presented, and this would be in rebuttal exhibit JMC4, there's not a single ROE there that approaches 14.91%.
Thank you. Do you provide other CAPM results that you believe the commission should consider?
The commission should consider all of the CAPM results that that I've presented. I believe that I presented the historical results. I presented the the forward-looking CAPM ROE, as well as two other results from other sources, Kroll and the Demoteran market risk premium. Those numbers range in the direct testimony from 7.8 to 8.08. I did let's see, did update those for my surrebuttal testimony, and the Demoteran and Kroll numbers range from 7.78 to 8.08, and the historical ROEs 8.68 to 9.67. This is from the surrebuttal testimony, and the actual CAPM ROE went up to 15.21 in the update.
Thank you. And I plan to ask you a little bit about each of those. Let's start with the 8.68% historical CAPM. That 8.68% CAPM is based on a risk premium component that is consistent with the research you cite in your testimony, correct?
Correct.
And just to point that out a little bit, on page 39, at the very top of the page, first 5 lines, you state, I explained earlier in my testimony that the historical risk premium that both witness Coyne and I use in our analyses is overstated due to an increase in the price to earnings ratio that should not be expected to persist into the future. Both Kroll and Roger Ibbotson recognize this and recommend that it be removed from the historical risk premium calculation. Is that right?
Yes.
This research you cite is basically it's saying that it's appropriate to account for the growth in the price to earnings ratio of stocks, correct?
Could you repeat the question, please?
The research you cite states that when calculating a risk premium, it is appropriate to account for the growth in price to earnings ratios of a stock.
Well, it's important to recognize it, and when you sort of remove this growth in the price earnings ratio, you have what's called a supply side market risk premium. That's something that Kroll provides as I believe it's updated yearly, but it provides an additional look at what the investor expected market risk premium would be. The theory behind that, or I guess really the practical consideration behind that, is investors wouldn't necessarily expect that increase in price earnings ratios to continue, well into the future. So when you're looking at these historical market risk premiums, you should, I would say look at both of them. Certainly, they're both publicly available, and there's enough research on the supply side, I think, to make that a viable consideration as well.
Thank you. And I think you touched on a couple of the questions I was going to ask you, but just want to point out one more point in your testimony there on page 39 on line 8. You talk about the supply side MRP, and you state, I calculate that using the supply side MRP, a risk-free rate of 3.5% and gas proxy group beta of 0.83 results in the CAPM of 8.68, correct?
That's right.
And did you also calculate a CAPM result based on Kroll's published market risk premium as of April 2022?
Yes.
And the result of that analysis was 8.08%, correct? Page 26 of your direct, lines 11 to 14.
Thank you. Hold on just a moment. Let me turn to that. 26, did you say, Counselor?
Yes, sir. Lines 11 to 14.
All right. I want to make sure I have my numbers straight. So in the direct testimony, the Kroll was 8.08, yes.
And you touched on this earlier as well, but you also calculated a CAPM result of 7.80% based on the market risk premiums published by NYU professor Damodaran.
Yeah, I think, or Damodaran. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, but yes, that's right.
Okay, thank you. And then again, that is also, I believe, on page 26 of your direct for the commission's reference.
Yes.
And on exhibit RAB4, specifically, I'm looking at page 2 of 3. You show that CAPM result of 9.67%. And that was also based on data from Kroll as well, correct?
Yes.
But that 9.67 does not account for the research cited by Kroll that historical risk premiums do not account for the expansion of PE ratios over time, does it?
No, that's just, that would just be the straight historical risk premium that that you would get from, or I'm sorry, that would just be the straight average returns for the S&P 500 that are calculated by Kroll over time. And that does not account for these the increase in the PE ratios over time. Right, so and that represents the top end of the range. However, I will say that number is sort of out there, and it might be something that investors could influence investors' expectations. So I did, for completeness sake, include that as well.
It would account for their expectations, right? If they didn't understand his the study about the removal or adjusting for the PE ratios.
Yeah, I mean, if they didn't know about that, that's true. They wouldn't know about the supply side.
I'm looking now at page 29 of your testimony. You note that let me see, make sure I got that right, actually.
Yes, I have that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I might be off on my page number. Let me just ask you this first and then I'll confirm the page number. In your testimony, you say that the compounded annual return was 6.40% between 1926 and 2021.
Okay. Let's see. Sure what you're referring to.
Yeah, I might have your. I'm not sure if it's in your rebuttal. I just realized it's not on
It
the
might
page of
be.
reference.
Is that in my response to Mr. Coyne, possibly, or?
Yeah, I believe that might be a rebuttal testimony. Let me grab a notebook just so we can confirm.
Okay.
Just a second.
I think, Mr. Hall, it's on page 39.
Okay, thank you. So again,
Yeah.
that compounded annual return was 6.40% between 1926 and 2021.
Well, wait. I think I got the wrong page, actually. Hold on. Okay, I've got it now. I apologize, Mr. Hall.
No, and I apologize for having the wrong number. And I'm looking at, make sure we're looking at the same thing. Page 39 of your direct, starting around lines 18.
Lines 18, that's right. So yes, Kroll's historical analysis shows that the average, the arithmetic average capital appreciation for the Standard & Poor 500 was 8.2%. For the historical period 1926 to 2021, and the geometric growth from endpoint to endpoint was 6.4%. And I think those. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Please finish your thought.
That's all right. That historical experience was sort of juxtaposed and compared to the growth rates for the S&P 500 that Mr. Coyne presented, which were 13.54%, 14.61%.
Thank you. And just to clarify, the arithmetic mean there, that is not what investors actually earn, is it? Or is it another way?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
It's the compounded annual return that investors actually earn, right?
When you talk about expectational analysis, you normally would use the arithmetic average of a long data series like that. The reason you would not use geometric average is because it's just a point-to-point analysis, and it's sort of deterministic in that sense, and it doesn't really include the probability of higher and lower returns over time. So I think from a financial theory point of view, you'd want to use the arithmetic average of returns.
That 8.2%, that's for the overall market?
Yes.
Okay. Is the overall market riskier than regulated utility companies?
Yes.
So investors who are relying on historical returns as a guide to future returns would expect to earn even less than the 6.4% compounded annual return going forward. Isn't that right?
Well, this is not this is growth. This is not an annual return. So let's let's kind of straighten that out.
Okay.
The annual return was 12.4%. The growth, and then Pearl has this information available which shows a component of that return being growth in capital appreciation over time. In other words, how the S&P grew, in other words. So what you're looking at there is growth rate, not overall return.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. And I think you just answered, but that 6.4% is again for the overall market.
Yes.
We were talking a little bit about price to earnings ratios before, and you may have actually said this, but just to clarify, is it possible for price to earnings ratios to keep expanding forever?
No.
And have you looked at what the price to earning ratios would be in 10 or 20 years from now?
I have not.
I'll ask you a little bit more about your CAPM. The beta component of your CAPM is based on Value Line's published 5-year historical betas, correct?
That's right.
And looking at Exhibit RAB4, the average Value Line beta that you used in your CAPM was 0.83.
Yes, that's right.
So considering that these betas include 5 years of historical data, would you agree that they're still being impacted by the market turmoil we experienced during the initial phase of the pandemic in March to April?
Yes, I would. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were finished with your question. I apologize for talking over you.
No problem. Just to clarify, you agree that that 5-year historical betas are being impacted by that March to April 2020 time period?
Yes, they definitely are. I would note that in recent cases that I've been involved in, those betas seem to be coming down somewhat from what we saw in what I saw in 2020, 2021. Before the pandemic, before the economic shutdowns and so forth, the average utility betas were much lower than this.
I've asked this question before, but I think to some other witnesses, but I think it's important to ask you as well. Are you aware that as Mr. Rothschild testified in his direct, that Commonwealth Edison raised $750 million of first mortgage bonds in March 2022 with an authorized ROE of 7.36 and a capital structure of 48.7% equity?
Well, I would be willing to accept that subject to check. I haven't, checked the source documents for that, but I'll accept it subject to check. I'll accept that he testified to that.
And you may have heard me ask this one as well earlier. Are you aware of Kiowa Island Utilities settlement in May 31st of this year for an 8.69% ROE?
Yes.
And do you agree that a company would not accept this 8.69 if they thought it would be detrimental to their ability to raise capital?
I would think not. I think that's a reasonable assumption. Now, I haven't, obviously I haven't, I didn't have any insight into the company's financials and or their thinking on that. But you would assume that in a settlement, the company wouldn't have accepted an ROE number that was against the interests of their financial indicators.
Thank you. I agree. You mentioned the RSA, the Rate Stabilization Act, a little bit in your testimony. Are you generally familiar with it?
I'm generally familiar with it.
And that the RSA process allows a revenue true up for the company once they get out of that 0.5 range around the ROE, correct?
Yes, that's my understanding. That's my general understanding of how it works, yes.
And is it your understanding that true up is allowed regardless of the reason? For example, whether there's not enough revenue because the company lost customers or they had increased costs or maybe they were just a poor performing company. Regardless of the reason, the RSA allows a true up to your knowledge. Isn't that right?
I'm not sure of that.
That's fair enough. And do you
I'm
know
not sure if there's, if it's a complete blank check like that. I don't know.
That's fair enough. Thank you. Do you know that the RSA only applies to gas companies?
I did not know that, but I'll accept that.
And we mentioned earlier here, I believe you said yes, but correct me if I'm wrong, that the ROE here will be used in every RSA case going forward unless the company settles for a lower number or a different number?
I would accept that again, subject to checking on it.
Okay. Would you agree that if market conditions change from now till next year, and whatever ROE the commission issues turns out to be too low for the company, that they could come back in for another rate case and try to get a different ROE?
Oh, sure. Yes, that's always possible. If they felt it was too low, they could also appeal the decision.
That's right. And are you aware that under South Carolina statutes, the utility can come back in every 12 months for a rate case if it chooses?
I'm not familiar with that statute.
I appreciate your time. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Commissioners, questions? Commissioner Caston?
Good afternoon, Mr. Baldino.
Good afternoon, Commissioner Caston.
Do you find Mr. Rothschild's analysis credible and reasonable in determining a fair ROE?
There are aspects of it that I think are reasonable. His constant growth DCF model, as I appreciate it, was based, the growth rate portion of it was based on what he called the retention growth, which is really the amount of earnings the firm retains in the company, exclusive of dividends, after dividends are paid, and earns a return on that, plus an additional accretion from stock sales above book value. So it's, just the letters that we use to describe that are BR plus SV. That's a standard method of calculating the growth rate. I've seen that presented in other cases. I think where I take issue with him is that that's the only one he uses. He doesn't really look at any other potential sources that would influence investor expectations of growth for gas company stocks. So his BR plus SV, the retention growth method is well worth considering as one aspect of the commission's considerations. I don't really agree with his beta calculations. I think for the same reasons that Mr. Coyne did not. This is based on some options calculations that he made. I don't think those, as far as I know, that approach is not used by investors. It's not publicly available that I know of. It's his calculation. So I think it's unlikely that would really influence investors' expectations of what they think beta should be. It's more likely, really, that investors would be influenced by betas that Mr. Coyne and I both used from Value Line and from Bloomberg.
Thank you. Page 3, your testimony, Sir Buttle.
Yes, sir, I have that.
You testify on page 3, and I don't know what line, but I'll look if you need to, that the investor required ROE for the gas proxy group has declined since you filed your direct testimony. You go on to state that the result of your analysis indicates DCF range of 9.08 to 9.24 through July 2022. Why do you still recommend a 9.3 ROE when your most recent analysis indicates a lower figure?
I think we, ORS and I decided to stick with the 9.3 because it did have the virtue of covering the same time period, which is through June, that Mr. Coyne and I believe Mr. Rothschild used. So that's consistent there. I was frankly a little surprised in this environment that the DCF numbers declined a bit. I would note, Commissioner, that 9.3 is fairly close to the 9.24% upper bound, and it's still within the range of DCF results that I present on page 3, which was 8.06 to 10.68. So that number is still within that range. So I think for our purposes here, we decided just to stick with the recommendation in the direct testimony.
Okay, but should we have more or greater interest in more recent or more accurate information, or just more interest in consistency with the time frame that others used?
I think you could do both, and really, if I were coming in new with that analysis, through July, my recommendation would likely be lower. I'd probably be recommending something like 9.15, which is the midpoint between 908 and 924, so something around like that.
Did you hear any of the prior testimony from Mr. O'Donnell?
Yes, I did.
And we were talking about reasonableness ranges, and I asked him, is 9 in that range? And I believe he said yes. Do you agree with that?
I do.
What if it were 8.9? Do you agree with that?
Yes, I actually would.
I won't keep going because I don't want to do that to you or anyone. One final question. Do you agree that the timing of when capital structure is determined could influence the ratio of debt and equity?
Yes, sir.
So do certain times of the year affect the earnings and structure differently?
Yes, and for gas companies, that's particularly true since they generate most of their earnings in the winter. So it's good to have a 1 year, 13-month average or a 12-month average capital structure that smooths that all out. Also, you also, to answer your question on history, I think it's good to look at a company's history as in capital structure. What is happening to its equity ratio, what's happening to its debt ratio over time. I have presented that analysis. So yes, maybe that's too long an answer for your question, but I think the period of time does make a difference.
And I don't remember what page it was on, but it was the table you showed that, I guess, past 6 years of, I guess, the debt equity ratio, or maybe the equity ratio, going back to March 31st, 2017, I think, through March 31st, 2022. And I just kind of looked at it. I think it ranged from like 49.79% to a high in 2019 of 55.35%. Correct?
Yes, sir. That's right. It's on table 3, page 31.
So relative to those ranges, and you also had I think a 3-year average and a 6-year average and maybe 2-year. Relative to those common equity ratios, in your opinion, what is better to use? Previous 6 years ratio, 3, 2?
That's a good question. I haven't, normally when I've looked at capital structures for utilities and gas utilities, I look at what their test period capital structure is. I look at what they've done historically, and I also look at, what's the capital structure that the proxy group is using. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend using a 6-year average or a 3-year average. The numbers I put in there for you is on table 3. It's more the purpose of it really was more to show historically what's going on with the company, and to show really that the commission's approved 52.2% common equity ratio in the RSA, which I agree was product of the settlement, that is a reasonable number, and that the company's 54.56 was not.
Okay. And it went from 49.79 to 55.35, 2 years, and 49.85 to 55.35 in 1 year. But relative to the ranges, I think it was Mr. O'Donnell, I can't recall. I think he was looking at, I think this is the case, looking at the total, and I assume this is on a national sense, the total equity versus the total debt, I think in terms of percentages. I've actually heard some numbers somewhere on what that would be, how many trillions in equity, how many trillions in debt. But I shouldn't guess, but I was thinking those numbers were somewhere closer to 51-49, 50-50 or something, but I don't recall. What is your opinion on that?
Well, I believe Mr. Coyne presented some evidence for us that the recent average allowed equity ratio was approximately 51% or slightly above 51%. And that's equity ratios that were recently authorized. In fact, let me just refer to his testimony, and hopefully I can help you out here with something a little more precise. Right. In Mr. Coyne's rebuttal testimony, figure 1, which you would find on his page 4, he has a comparison of ROE and capital structure recommendations with national averages. And in that figure, he shows the national average for gas utilities 2021 through 2022. You've got a 51.58% approved equity ratio with a range of 46.26 up to 59.88. Does that help you a bit? Or?
Yes.
Okay, great.
And again, I'm just like all the other commissioners sitting here, trying to understand it, trying to get my head around it, trying to make the best decision for everyone.
Yes, sir.
Best possible. Yeah, all these numbers, 54, it's all got to add up to 100 somewhere.
Yes, sir.
I think that's all questions I have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Commissioners, any other questions? Redirect, Mr. Huber.
Very briefly, Madam Chair. Mr. Baldino, you were asked a question by Mr. Hall about whether the capital structure approved in this rate proceeding could be adjusted in the RSA in future years, correct?
Yes.
I'm going to place a copy of the stipulation on the projector. This is a little dangerous. I'm not very familiar with this, but bear with me just a moment. Are you able to see paragraph 14 okay there, Mr. Baudino?
Yes.
And I've highlighted it there. And that paragraph states that Piedmont understands, acknowledges, and agrees that its capital structure may be reviewed and adjusted as part of the annual RSA proceeding, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And thank you for clearing that up.
Thank you, Mr. Baudino. And to the extent there is uncertainty about the ability to adjust cap structure in the RSA, this would clarify that, correct?
Yes, it would.
Thank you, Mr. Baudino. I appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
Very brief recalls, please,
On,
on that question.
okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Kind of just state an objection briefly, since this wasn't contemplated by the stipulation to have recrossed, but
Overruled.
thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Baldino, I just want to clarify that you're not familiar with what the statute says about the RSA and the capital structure. Is that right?
I did review that statute, but I don't recall what the language is on that.
And just to the point of that statement that Mr. Huber read that said it may be adjusted, and you would agree that because it may be adjusted does not mean that it's guaranteed to change, correct?
Well, yes. I mean, may be adjusted means you have the opportunity to adjust it. I think that's the important thing.
And that could be the result of a settlement, but you're not aware of whether the commission has a right to change it, are you?
I mean, to come in on its own motion and just change it. I'm not sure I know what you're asking.
You don't know whether my original question was that the capital structure would be the same for each RSA case going forward, and you weren't sure. Is that right?
Right. Now, I think that paragraph 14 kind of clarifies that it will be used unless it's, but it is subject to change. It may be subject to change.
Okay. And so I'm gonna go ahead and show you the statute because again, you understand that the department was not part of the settlement agreement regarding capital structure.
That's right.
So just to clarify, I just want to show you, this is the RSA statute 585410. The highlighted section states, in carrying out the procedures established by this article with respect to such an election, the commission shall rely upon and utilize the approved rates, charges, revenue expenses, capital structure, returns, and other matters established in the Public Utilities most recent general rate proceeding pursuant to 585240. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you. Mr. Baldino, thank you for your testimony this afternoon. You may step down.
Okay. Thank you.
Madam Chair, may Mr. Baudino be excused?
Same admonition and warning I give to everybody else, but yes, he may at your request.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Who's our next witness? Is that Mr. Rothschild?
I was wondering if we could confer. I don't think Mr. Rothschild will get done today.
No, I don't think so either. That's why is he the next witness is my question.
He is the next witness on our list.
Okay. I think we're going to break for the day.
Okay.
So we'll have Mr. Rothschild this morning and then 2 more witnesses. Is that correct?
We have 2 more witnesses that Mr. Hall wishes to cross-examine.
Right.
And they both, One of them is an ROE cap structure witness, and the other, I think, mentions.
Okay, so we have
ROE.
2 for cross-examination and 2 settlement witnesses, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so we've got Mr. Rothschild and then 4. We will break today, and then if there, I'll confer with commissioners, and if there are any questions that they have for any of the stipulating witnesses, we'll let you know in the morning.
Thank you.
Is that okay? All right, we are recessed until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow. Thank you. Pleasant evening.